we'll get started. Next week, Mitchell Remuda from Cell and Molecular Biology will be here talking about pulling viruses out of thin air. That's pretty amazing stuff. He's in the O'Connor lab, and they're doing amazing things with all kinds of viruses, including COVID, and so they're looking at ways to sample water and air in a big way. On December 14th, Dan McCammon from physics will be here, and he's a professor in physics, and he's going to talk about what the heck is X-ray astronomy and why do we care. So looking forward to that. He builds and launches X-ray astronomy instruments on sounding rockets, and he sends the rockets up here in North America, but he also goes to Australia to launch them, and I'm hoping for some really good pictures. This will be the last Wednesday night at the lab for 2022. We'll take December 21st and December 28th off for Christmas and New Year's, and then we'll fire back up on the 4th of January. So thanks for coming tonight, and I hope to see you next week. And if you want to stand here, I'll do the little more formal presentation. I know. And is your microphone on?
Yep, it is.
Good. My little green light is on, so let's hope. Welcome everyone to Wednesday Night at the Lab. I'm Tom Zinn, and I work here at the UW-Madison Biotechnology Center. I also work for the Division of Extension Wisconsin 4-H. And on behalf of those folks and our other co-organizers, PBS Wisconsin, the Wisconsin Alumni Association, and the UW-Madison Science Alliance, thanks again for coming to Wednesday Night at the Lab. We do this every Wednesday night, 50 times a year. Tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Mike Arnold. He's a professor in the Department of Materials Science and Engineering. I got that right. Good.
That's right.
And he's going to talk with us about the fact that the sun is ready to make your electricity greener and cheaper in Wisconsin. Yay. Now I'm going to ask you the 5 questions I ask everybody.
Uh-oh.
The standard line is, doesn't have to be true, it just has to be believable. Where were you born?
I was born in Illinois, near Chicago.
Where?
Elk Grove Village.
Oh, gee, that's good. And then where'd you go to high school?
Also near Chicago, a suburb, Dundee Crown High School.
Excellent. And then where'd you go for your undergrad and what'd you study?
University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, electrical engineering.
Nice. And then where'd you go for your advanced degrees and what did you study?
I did a PhD at Northwestern University, did a little bit of study, postdoctoral studies at University of Michigan, and then came here. So I'm going around Lake Michigan.
Wow, that's pretty good. Going to Houghton anytime? No. Okay. When did you arrive here in Madison?
I've been here since 2008.
Excellent. Well, I really appreciate it. We're looking forward to finding out about this cool stuff. Would you please join me in welcoming Mike Arnold to Wednesday Night at the Lab?
Thanks, Tom. So I'm excited to be here to talk to you today about solar cells. Before I start, I just want to acknowledge some of the research funding from my group. Sorry, I got to go backwards here. From the National Science Foundation and the Department of Energy. So I gave a talk right here in a Wednesday night in the lab in 2010 on the same exact topic, on solar cells. Back then, the title of my talk was, "Why doesn't my electricity come from the sun?" So it was a little bit more negative of a presentation. So this was almost 13 years ago. And 13 years ago, the price and economics and viability of solar cells just wasn't ready. There weren't that many solar cells out there. They were too expensive. And so the talk really focused on, well, what needed to happen to make solar electricity more viable. So we're going to throw away that negativity. Today we have a much more positive talk. So we are ready to transform how we produce our energy in the state of Wisconsin. The sun is ready to do that. So that's the main point I want to make to you today, is that really the solar photovoltaics industry has gone through a transformation, and the science and engineering behind it has made that possible, and we're really in a different time. But I also want to teach you about, in general, some really cool stuff. I want to tell you about how the sun is just this enormous source of energy for us. And that solar cells, photovoltaic solar cells, can transduce and harvest this light into electricity. And I'm going to teach you how a solar cell works. I'm going to teach you how it works on the level of atoms and electrons. And then we'll talk about the different types of solar cells they are, how efficient they are, their economics, and then solar in Wisconsin now and in the future. So let's jump right in. So the sun is a source of energy. So to really know how much energy we need from the sun, we have to know how much energy do we use as a society. So this is a flow chart showing all of the energy produced and used in the United States in 2019. So on the left are the inputs, the sources of energy, and on the right are where they're used. The numbers, which I'll magnify in a second here, are how much energy is used in each little box, and that is measured in quad. A quad is 1 quadrillion BTU. So BTU is just a unit of energy. It's like British thermal unit. It's an odd unit. Scientists like to think in terms of energy in terms of joules. So 1 quadrillion BTU is 10 to the 18th. So that's 1 with 18 zeros after it, joules of energy. That's what 1 quad. And if you add up all these boxes of energy sources on the left, it adds up to about 100 quads, or 10 to the 20th joules of energy. That's how much we use in the United States. About 1.5% of that is currently produced from solar. About 15% are non-fossil fuels in total. The rest, around 85%, come from fossil fuels currently. And these are used residentially, commercially, industrially, and in transportation. So one of the first things I want to take away from this is we use around 10 to the 20th joules of energy. And I want to teach you how much this really is, because we're going to look at how much this is per each of you, for each person in the United States. So 10 to the 20th joules. If we divide by the population of the United States, which is around 330 million people, that's 3 times 10 to 11 joules per year per person. Well, how much is that? How much is a joule really? So to make that more clear, I have an analogy for you. So if I'm in the gym, if I'm over at the university gym, and I'm a scrawny, weak professor, so this is really hard for me, but if I try to take a 20-pound dumbbell and lift it about 3 feet, I'm working against gravity by about 100 joules. So that's, 20 pounds is pretty heavy. That's 100 joules, and we're using 3 times 10 to the 11th joules of energy. So let's compare those numbers. So each one of us is using this much energy every year. That's our share. So we're not using that in our homes, but that's our share of our transportation, our industrial, commercial, residential share. So that's a lot of times of lifting that weight. In fact, if you wanted to supply your own energy by lifting a dumbbell and somehow harnessing that energy, you'd have to lift it 3 billion times a year, each one of you. That's 340,000 times an hour. I definitely know I can't lift that much. So we use a lot of energy. Energy per time, another name for that is power. Power is measured in watts. Think about a light bulb, an old-fashioned light bulb. You screw it in, a 60-watt light bulb, you know about how much light that would produce. So if you divide this 10 to the 20th joules by 31 million seconds in a year, you get 3 trillion watts. So the United States is continuously using, on average, averaged over night and day, over all the seasons, 3 trillion watts. So that's a lot of light bulbs. And worldwide, that's our energy uses from societies around 18 trillion watts, or terawatts. Can the sun produce this much energy? Yes, it can. So the sun is this enormous source of energy. The sun is continuously outputting 10 to the 26th watts of light. Now, of course, the Earth is pretty far from the sun. It's 93 million miles away. The diameter of the Earth is only a meager 8,000 miles, so we're only collecting a pretty small fraction of the sunlight. But even still, that small fraction of this really huge number is really huge in its own right. So the sun is constantly shining on the Earth 3 times 10 to the 17th watts. That's it right now. It's in full form. This is how much we use globally for all forms of energy use. So if we could harness just a fraction of this solar energy, we can supply all of our energy needs. Another way to think about solar radiation is normalizing it by area. So at noon in a sunny day, about 1,000 watts of sunlight reaches the surface of the Earth per every meter by meter. Of course, it's not always sunny. It's not always noon. There's different seasons. And if you average over time, you see the average intensity of sunlight on the Earth, averaging over light and dark, is around 100 to 300 watts per meter squared, depending on where you are. Of course, this has been mapped across the United States. Down in the American Southwest, we have much more sunlight. There's not that many clouds. It's further south. Arizona receives around 290 watts per meter squared on average. Wisconsin, we receive about half that much. But if you add up that per meter squared over all the meters of Wisconsin, that is still 20 trillion watts on average, and 86 trillion watts in Arizona. And reminder, in the US, we're only using 3 trillion watts at any given time. So we just need a small fraction of our land converted to harvesting sunlight to really make solar possible and viable way of supplying all of our energy needs. In fact, if you were to take the American Southwest and cover a 140 by 140 mile tract with solar cells around 20% efficient, which is a very viable number, you could cover all of our energy needs in the United States. Of course, there's no way currently to distribute that energy across the country, but that's the scale of the area we would need. All right, so conclusions about the first part of the talk is that humankind's energy needs are enormous, but the energy we receive from the sun is much more enormous. And we could power our society or a large fraction of our society's activities if the proper technology were available and affordable for converting sunlight into electricity. And that's exactly what a photovoltaic solar cell does. All right, so second part of this presentation is going to look at how a solar cell works and what is it made from. And we're going to look a little bit into aspects of chemistry and material science and engineering when we look at this. So solar cells transduce light into electricity. We're going to start off thinking of a solar cell as just this mysterious black box. We don't know what's in it. We shine light on it, we get electricity. So a solar cell has a negative terminal and a positive terminal, just like a battery. You know, you hook up a circuit to a battery and electricity will flow through your circuit. The same thing happens with a solar cell. So you have a negative, positive terminal. Electrons or electricity flow from the negative terminal to the positive terminal and power whatever's in your circuits. It could be a toaster, or you could charge your electric car. So what's inside this black box? At heart, the active material transducing light to electricity is a semiconductor. The most common semiconductor in the world is silicon. There are other parts of a solar cell like metal, glass, structural materials, but it's really the semiconductor doing the work. Both computer chips and solar cells are both made from semiconductors. And both are typically made from silicon. Luckily, we have an enormous amount of silicon on the Earth's crust. So sand, glass, many minerals are made from silicon. It's one of the most abundant elements we have. So that's great news. There are other semiconductors useful for solar cells. There are many, many different compounds and elements that make semiconductors, but silicon and cadmium tellurium, the second one, are the most common ones. All right, so what makes a semiconductor a semiconductor? So a semiconductor is interesting. It could be tuned so it could act either like a conductor, like this metal copper wire that conducts electricity, or it could be tuned to act like an insulator, like rubber or glass that does not conduct electricity. And actually, it could be tuned dynamically and switched at will. A semiconductor can be what's called doped. It could be modified to conduct either negative charge, which is electrons, or positive charge, which I'll explain a little bit more. It's called a hole. And a semiconductor has what's called an energy gap or band gap. And understanding the energy gap or band gap of a semiconductor is essential to understanding how it converts light to electricity. So that's what we'll look at next. So the really gain insight into band gap and how a semiconductor converts light to electricity, we first have to look at how electrons are, and it's just a single atom, one atom at a time. So an atom has this positively charged nucleus, and the electrons can be thought of as just orbiting around, kind of like planets going around the sun. Planets stay in the orbit around the sun because gravity attracts them. That's why they don't just go off in a straight line. Electrons go in orbit around the nucleus because positive nucleus and the negative electrons attract each other. Opposites attract when it comes to electrostatics. So the electrons go in these orbits, and there's only a discrete number of orbits allowed. And when the electron is in different orbits, it has a different amount of energy. So when the electrons are closest to the nucleus, they're lowest in energy. So up on the screen here is energy. And as they go further away, they go higher in energy. And there's these discrete levels. So that's something you may or may not have learned in high school chemistry, if you could remember back to those days. So what happens, though, when you don't have just one atom, but you have many atoms? So a semiconductor is a solid. It has trillions and trillions of atoms all packed closely together. So each one of those discrete energy levels splits. When you have two atoms, the electron orbitals, shown here in blue, overlap a little, and one level splits into two. When you have three atoms, you get three energy levels. Four atoms, you get four energy levels. And when you have many, many atoms, trillions and trillions and trillions of atoms, it splits into trillions and trillions of energy levels that are so finely spaced that you have almost a continuous band. Effectively, you have a continuous band of energy levels. That's a band in a material. All materials, metals, semiconductors, insulators, have bands where the electrons can be. Now, this splitting happens for all the different orbitals. The first orbital, the second orbital, third level, making bands. Then you look in the periodic table and see how many electrons are supposed to be in that atom, and you start filling up these levels, and you start filling up the bands. So the blue here is representing where the electrons are, what bands they're in. And it turns out in a semiconductor, there's filled band, and then there's a gap, and then there's empty band. This is the signature of a semiconductor. When you ever have a material with this configuration, you have a semiconductor. And the difference in energy between here and here, that's called your band gap. Now, how does light come into this? When you shine light on your semiconductor, it kicks up an electron higher in energy from the filled band to the empty band. And it leaves a hole where the electron used to be. The hole can be thought of as having a positive charge. So these are the electron in the hole, the positive and negative charge we need to separate to opposite sides of our solar cell to make it like a battery. So we have negative and positive connection on our battery. So the trick of a solar cell is taking these charges and separating them. So you can't just use a semiconductor to make a solar cell. You need a semiconductor to make the charges from the light, and then you need a trick to separate them. So how do you separate these charges? So if we look spatially at a solid of silicon, each one of these little silicons here is supposed to be a one silicon atom. It's bonded to four other silicons. Light comes in, makes this positive and negative charge that we need to separate, but there's nothing to really induce their separation. They kind of just stay together. So how do we get them to separate? The trick is to use what's called doping. So we know from the sports world what doping means. Doping in sports means taking a foreign substance, injecting it into your body to improve your performance. Doping of a semiconductor is not that much different. You take a foreign substance, which is some impurity atom, and you put it in your semiconductor to improve its performance. So it's the intentional addition of impurity atoms to our semiconductor. This is essential to making a solar cell. So this is looking at the periodic table. If our solar cell is made from silicon, then the dopants we want to add are right next to the silicon in the periodic table. So this is group 4 of the periodic table. There's 4 electrons in the outer shell, all these elements along this column. Group 5 has 5 electrons in the outer shell, like phosphorus. Group 3 has 3 electrons in the outer shell, like boron. So those are the dopants we're going to talk about. If we take silicon and we add phosphorus, so we kick out a silicon atom and add phosphorus instead. Phosphorus has 5 electrons. 4 of those go into making bonds to the nearest neighbor silicons. It has 1 extra. This 1 extra electron is free to move around. That's called N-type doping of our silicon because it adds free negative charge. N stands for negative. On the contrary, if we add boron, we replace 1 silicon with boron. Boron only has 3 electrons in its outer shell. But it needs to form 4 bonds with the neighboring silicon atoms because that's just how silicon atoms pack together in a crystal. So it steals an electron from somewhere else, leaving a hole, and that positively charged hole is able to move around. So that's positive type doping of our silicon, or p-type doping. All right, so what? I haven't told you how the charges separate in the solar cell yet. But this doping is critical for making that happen. So what a solar cell is it's 1 p-type doped portion of silicon, or a semiconductor, 1 n-type portion of silicon joined together. So you take these 2 doped semiconductors, join them together seamlessly to make what's called a p-n junction. P-n junction is a solar cell. So what happens is some of these holes which are positively charged, they could just kind of move around on their own, and some of them migrate a little bit onto the inside. And some of the electrons from the inside, they kind of migrate a little bit onto the p side. Now we have a net negative charge over here and a net positive charge over here. Now when new charges are generated from light, they're going to be attracted, so like a new electron is generated from light, it's going to be attracted towards the positively charged side, and a new positive charge is going to be attracted to the negatively charged side. So if we get rid of all this, we could just say there's a new built-in electric field due to these wandering free charges, and then when light comes in, these charges spontaneously separate. So now every time light wave comes in, kicks an electron up from the one band to the next, leaving a hole, they separate on their own to one side of our device and to the other side of the device. This is exactly what we need. We're not using energy to make the separation happen. It's generating energy. It's happening on its own. So a solar cell is a p-n junction. You take a slab of silicon, dope it p-type, slab, dope it n-type. Light comes in, it generates electron and hole. The electrons go up, the holes go down. You have a grid of metal wires that collect the negative charge on one side, another grid on the other side that collects the positive charge, and these go to your positive and negative terminals of your solar cell. So our black box, then, is just a semiconductor that's doped to be a p-n junction. And when light comes in, it's kicking these electrons up from one band to the next across the band gap. So active materials in photovoltaic cells are semiconductors. We have this band gap. We have this p-n junction. All right, so I hope you learned, at least got something out of that, about how a solar cell works. Now I want to talk about how the different types of solar cells and how efficient they are. So this is a plot created by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, which is from the Department of Energy, of many different solar cell types being researched and how efficient they are versus time, so versus year. One observation is, well, wow, there's a lot of different types of solar cells out there. Maybe you're here because you're interested in putting a solar cell on your roof of your house. You're like, how am I ever going to sort through all this? Well, don't worry. These are just ones being researched in the research lab. The ones commercially available, it's much easier to sort through those, and I'll explain that. But there are many different types, and they're all sloped upward. The efficiency is improving with time. So research and development is leading to better and better solar cells. So this is research and development happening at universities, at national laboratories, and at companies. The other thing we see is that the efficiency here is varying between 10 and 47%. So the world's best solar cell is around 47% efficient. Now, the efficiency of a solar cell is how much electrical energy it produces per light energy incident on that, shining on your solar cell. So the world record is 47%. Typical commercial cell that you would have for residential or utility scale applications are going to be between 20, 25% efficient, somewhere in the middle. So are these efficiencies good? You may think, wow, well, why isn't it 100%? Well, actually, there are thermodynamic limits that say you can't get higher than 30% for single p-n junction and a bunch of other reasons that would limit the efficiency. But even still, you might think, well, the 20% doesn't seem very good. So let's compare ourselves to how well nature converts light into energy that can be used for other purposes. Photosynthesis. So photosynthesis in plants has evolved over hundreds of millions of years. How efficient is this process? Where we take light, take carbon dioxide and water, and we create sugars. Right? So this is chemical energy, different than electrical energy. How efficient is this? Well, it's only around 10%, 8.5% efficient. But a lot of this chemical energy goes into regenerating the plant. And so if we wanted to harvest that for, say, biofuels, it's only around 4% efficient. So this natural process that's evolved over hundreds of millions of years is only 4% efficient, and humankind has engineered devices that are 20 to 47% efficient. So it's really pretty impressive. And we've only really been working on solar cells for half a century. So back to this chart. There are so many different types of cells. What's going on with these different cells? Isn't a solar cell just a p-n junction? Well, there's different flavors to this. So your materials, your semiconductors, how the atoms are arranged, can be arranged in a perfect crystal where all the atoms have this same pattern repeated over and over and over again over the entire semiconductor. Or you could have polycrystalline, where you have crystals, multiple crystals, but they all have different orientations with respect to each other, with kind of misarrangements at the interface between them. Or you can have no arrangement of the atoms whatsoever. Crystalline and polycrystalline are how atoms are arranged in most solar cells. Amorphous materials are very cheap to make. Your pocket calculator that might be powered by solar cells, this is typically amorphous silicon. So amorphous solar cells are really only relevant for really low power applications like pocket calculators. You could have a p-n junction, or you could have multiple p-n junctions with different band gaps that capture different colors of light. And that ends up being a little bit more efficient than a single band gap. It's more expensive to make. Almost all commercial solar cells are single p-n junctions. Those world's best ones are multiple p-n junctions, but they're too expensive. They're used in things like satellites. Different thicknesses of the semiconductor. You have a very thin film of a semiconductor on a glass substrate, or you have a very thick bulk amount of semiconductor. And of course, you can make different compositions. So that's how all these different research solar cells are varying. The blue ones, those are the silicon ones. They're the most common, 20, 25% efficient. They come in either single crystalline or multicrystalline varieties. The green ones are thin films. Those are very thin films that are polycrystalline. They are typically made from cadmium tellurium. These are those multi-junction expensive ones used in satellites where cost is not as big of a deal as having highest power per weight, since you're lifting it into space. And then these are research cells that aren't ready for prime time yet. So really, we just think about silicon and thin film. So these single crystal silicon, single crystal, single p-n junction, thick slab of semiconductor is silicon. Let's look at how these are made. You take sand, you reduce it, chemically reduce it, which means remove the oxygen. So sand is silicon dioxide. You remove the oxygen. You purify it. You remove all the other atoms that aren't silicon to as large of an extent as you can. That's so you don't have unintentional dopants in your semiconductor. So you make it over 99.9999% pure. It's called polycrystalline silicon. Then you melt it. It turns into a liquid at around 1400 degrees Celsius. It's very high temperature, which makes the production of single crystal silicon cells a little bit expensive. You take a seed crystal and you dip it into the melt and you slowly pull it out with an instrument, a machine, to produce this enormous single crystal. All the atoms here have the same repeating what's called lattice and the same orientation. Then you slice this up into thin wafers or something like a wafer, and then you can add your dopants and your metal grids, and you have then you lay those out into rectangles, and you make your solar cells. This is a nice video for the process. If you, and by the way, if you go to my website, all these slides are available for your download. So you can find this video and watch this process if you want. Polycrystalline cells are the other type of cell you could buy and put on your roof or put in the solar installation utility. And these are just the same as single crystal cells, but they're just polycrystalline. The advantage of a polycrystalline cell is it's cheaper to make. You don't have to melt your silicon at 1400 degrees Celsius. You could deposit polycrystalline silicon from a gas of silicon and hydrogen called silane at only 650 degrees Celsius. That dramatically lower temperature translates into much less energy usage during the manufacturing. But, so it's cheaper to make. You might think, well, why isn't this better? It's less efficient because those electrons and holes generated by the light, they find each other and recombine. The electron fills the hole, giving off heat more readily at the boundaries between the grains. And you see the different grains here by the different contrasts. If you see a cell that looks like this ever, it's a polycrystalline cell. You're seeing the different texture of the different grains. Thin film cells is the third one you could buy. These are polycrystalline as well, single p-n junction. They're made from elements, though, like cadmium and tellurium, that absorb light much more strongly than silicon. So you don't need as much of it. You could have very, very thin films of it. So a single crystal silicon solar cell might be several hundred micrometers thick, whereas the cadmium-tellurium semiconductor layer is only a few micrometers thick. So you need less material. And you can make them at low temperature as well. So they're less, but they're less efficient. So they're less efficient and they're cheaper, just like the polycrystalline silicon cells. So if you look at what's actually selling out there in the marketplace, it boils down to these three different types of solar cells: single crystal silicon, polycrystalline silicon, and thin film cadmium tellurium. This is a plot. Going up is time. The width is the production of PV cells of each type. Well, first of all, look, the sum is growing massively in between the year 2000 and now. There's almost exponential growth in how much PV is being produced and installed around the world. Secondly, if you look at any given wedge here of any of these different colors, they're all growing, but single crystal cells are growing the fastest. You can see they're really becoming dominant. So it's almost certain that if you were to install PV in your residence, currently there's almost certainly be single crystal silicon cells. And these are, as a reminder, around 20% efficient. All right, so let's look at economics of solar cells. All right, so we're going to look at two different scales, residential scale and utility farm. Utility scale of like a solar farm. So in the residential scale, you might have panels on your roof. They generate electricity. Unlike the electricity coming from like the outlet in your wall, that electricity is what's called DC. It's constant with time. So you use what's called an inverter to convert that constant electricity into a time-varying electricity at roughly 60 hertz, which is what's coming out of the wall. You could then use that in your home, or you can sell excess back to the utility or have it used by other consumers connected to the grid. Utility scale is where, rather than having photovoltaics on your home, there's a big solar power plant somewhere out there. That's a big tract of land covered by solar cells, maybe thousands of them or hundreds of thousands of them. An inverter is also used, and then the electricity is transmitted to residential, commercial, and industrial customers. So we're going to look at both these situations. All right, so this is looking at the cost of a solar cell, the initial cost for residential versus time. This is a study from National Renewable Energy Laboratory again. This is looking at installed cost to customer, including the cost of the solar panel itself, the installation, labor, taxes, everything, including profit by a typical company. Back in 2010, when I was last here, it would cost you $7.50 per watt of solar cell that you'd put on your roof. Let's say you want to put 1,000 watts solar cell. So that's, and by the way, that's peak watts. So that's how much power our solar cell would generate at noon on a sunny day. It's just the standard the industry uses when quantifying these things. It costs $7.50. That price has come down dramatically to less than $3 in the last decade. Utility scale, just by virtue of economies of scale, is already much cheaper, and it's now less than $1 per watt. All right, but that's the initial cost. We don't really care about that. We care about like the dollars per kilowatt hour, the cents per kilowatt hour. So another way to look at this is energy cost per kilowatt hour. So when you get your bill from the power company, it tells you how many kilowatt hours you used in a given month, and the cost of the electricity, at least where I live, is around 15 cents per kilowatt hour. So how does solar compare to that? Well, to know how it compares to that, you have to know how long you're going to use your solar cells for. Because all the cost is up front. So if you're just going to use them for a day, then that's going to be very expensive electricity for just one day. But these panels are designed to last 25, 30 years. So this axis right here is energy cost per kilowatt hour if you keep your photovoltaics for 30 years. Okay? This is a little bit complicated plot because there's a lot going on. The red is how much it would cost without a tax credit. But there is currently, in the US, a tax credit, and that's what the blue is. So this is ITC, 30% tax credit. The recent Inflation Reduction Act that was passed has kept this ITC through the year 2032. So really, we should just look at the blue curve here. This is how much you would pay with tax credit. Then, this is a National Renewable Energy Lab looking at costs all throughout the United States. They picked 3 different locations in the United States. The top is the price in New York City, which just happens to have a pretty similar amount of sunlight as Madison, Wisconsin. So we should be looking at the top. The bottom is Phoenix, Arizona. The middle is, I think, Kansas City, yeah. So we see back in 2010, when I was last year, if you kept your solar cell 30 years, your electricity would still cost 35 cents a kilowatt hour, which is much more than the 15 cents a kilowatt hour typical for utility. This has now come down to less than 10 cents per kilowatt hour in just one decade. It's even more rosy if you look at how much solar costs for utility scale. So utility scale solar has come down to less than 5 cents per kilowatt hour. So this amazing improvements. So this rapid decline in cost has resulted in rapid adoption of solar voltaics across the globe. So this is the net amount of peak power of solar panels installed throughout the world as a function of time. This is a logarithmic scale here. So every mark here is a factor of 10. So it's a straight line, and this logarithmic scale means it's exponentially increasing with time. So roughly every 10 years, this is increasing by a factor of 10. So we have over 1,000 times improvements in the scale of photovoltaic installations between roughly the year 1999 and now. If we look, this goes through 2018, but if we look through 2021, we now have over terawatts of peak power solar panels installed throughout the world. In the United States, there's also this dramatic growth. So this is looking at utility, commercial, and residential. We see this dramatic growth reaching 100 gigawatts of installed solar in the last year. All right, why has there been this dramatic growth? Well, I wish I could say it's only due to this amazing research going on in professors' labs around the world, but it's not just that. One is just capitalism and economies of scale. The business of manufacturing and installing solar has just become dramatically more efficient, and that's a self-propelling kind of thing. But research and development has made improvements in both cell efficiency and decreasing materials processing costs. And also government policy. So these tax credits have played a large role in encouraging the expansion of solar photovoltaics as well. All right, so let's look now more at what's going on in Wisconsin. So we looked at this cost per kilowatt hour over 30 years. And the idea here is that with tax credit, we expect electricity to be about 9 cents per kilowatt hour. That's pretty favorable compared to this 15 cent per kilowatt hour that we get right now from the power company. But another thing to think about, though, is that that rate from the power company is right now. It's going to inflate with time. Maybe 15 cents per kilowatt hour now, but in 30 years, who knows? It might be 30 cents per kilowatt hour. But if you install photovoltaics right now, you're really locking in the cost because you're paying almost all of the cost up front. So you're locking in a cost of around 9 cents per kilowatt hour, which means you'll have enormous savings over 30 years. And if you don't plan to live in your residence for 30 years, it's okay because the break-even point is going to be even much less than 15 years. So if we look at the payback time, this is a nice website, solarreviews.com, solar panel cost, Wisconsin. It'll give you an estimate for this payback time. So here, this is for a rooftop 5.8 kilowatt system. Cost is around $10,000. Payback time would be only around 10 years. After that, you've paid for the initial cost. All additional savings will save you on your power bill after that. You could save, according to this site, which I think is fairly accurate, over $20,000. So an investment of $10,000 now will pay for itself and then give you a profit, which is really just saved in future energy bills of $20,000 in 30 years. So 10 years ago, if you wanted to install solar, you were really doing it for the environmental reasons. Now, you could both do it for the environmental reasons and save money. So it's really a turning point because saving money interests everyone in the world. And the utility costs, now being less than 5 cents per kilowatt hour, has really spurred the adoption of development all across the state of new solar farms. So here is a list from Renew Wisconsin, which is a great, they have a great website really enforcing a lot of the things we talked about today, of recent or upcoming solar farms on the order of 150 megawatt scale. So here is one, the Two Creeks Solar Farm in Manitowoc County. There's 500,000 solar panels across 800 acres, 150 megawatts of electricity. So it's this enormous area here. Here's another one in Iowa County, the Badger Hollow Solar Park. There's 2 phases to this. The first phase alone is 150 megawatts, 500,000 solar panels. So this is tens of thousands of homes that could be powered. So it's just, again, this these massive arrays of solar panels kind of spread out unevenly through this project area. All right, so let's look a little bit into the future. So looking forward, we think the economies of scale will continue to push these prices down, and R&D will continue to make cheaper and better materials to improve this dollar to watt ratio. But there are other challenges. So right now, the penetration of solar into the energy industry is pretty small. So we could use the electricity solar produces during the day, we could almost use that right away. But if we try to get a larger and larger fraction of our energy from solar, then we start running into a problem of like, how do we use solar energy to power our homes and businesses at night? And there we need improvements in energy storage, not just photovoltaics. There, optimistically, there have been dramatic improvements in energy storage as well. The price of energy storage plus solar, if you would put it on your residence, is also now dipping below that 15 cents per kilowatt hour. So it's getting to the point where, at least for short-term energy storage, it's becoming economically viable as well. Another problem, at least on the utility scale, is we have this huge infrastructure all across the state already for fossil fuel energy. All right, so there's these natural gas and coal power plants all across the state. So it's going to take time to transition those and for those to retire, where we could retire those and transition to solar. And of course, solar needs a lot of land. And so how do you negotiate these things. So this is a lot of politics and social aspects that need to be worked through. But the technology and the science is there. One last little bit about R&D of new materials and processes. As a professor at the university, that's what gets me the most excited. So new materials that are being investigated for solar are really focusing on materials that can be made at room temperature. So you don't need 1400 degrees Celsius, you don't need 650 degrees Celsius. You can make these at room temperature, very low cost. So semiconductors that can be made at room temperature, very low cost, include organic molecules. So organics are carbon-based molecules. So these materials are more similar to the materials that make humans and animals and biology and trees, and they're more similar to natural materials. They can be made very cheaply in the beaker. But one challenge with them is they are not as stable as inorganic materials like silicon. My research group is really focused on using nanotechnology and nanomaterials. We're really interested in using semiconducting carbon nanotubes, which are sheets of carbon rolled into tubes as kind of like semiconducting wires. These absorb light very strongly, and there's a lot of really exciting reasons to try to study these. There are a bunch of groups around the world working on hybrid organic, inorganic materials that combine both aspects of like organic and inorganics. And these have had amazingly promising results over the last several years. They're called inorganic-organic hybrid perovskites. And in just a few years of research, it's already been possible to make solar cells as good as silicon, or almost as good as silicon, but at room temperature. Stability, though, and lifetime are still not as good. So these are not ready for prime time yet, but they may be soon if we can improve their chemical stability. So to conclude this part about economics, and in general, the technology behind photovoltaics has rapidly matured. The scale of the production installation has grown exponentially. Prices plummeted. It's now cost competitive or cost superior. So the sun is ready to make your electricity greener and cheaper in Wisconsin. So thank you. All right.
All right. So we're going to try the handheld microphone, but you have to play like you're on your lips. Yay.
No problem. My question is regarding, could this technology be used, like, let's say, for electric cars or for, like, the trucking industry where you could put all the solar panels maybe on the trailers to help power the trucks?
Right. So there's enough area on a truck or a car to charge it as it drives. But you can use photovoltaics to charge your car, you just need bigger areas of them. So take solar cells covering your whole roof, that amount of electricity could be used to charge your car, or some fraction of a solar farm could be used to charge your car. So that 1,000 watts per meter squared is like how much you could get at most if you had 100% efficient solar cell, and there just aren't that many meters squared on a car, unfortunately. Yeah. Unless you had an extremely lightweight car, super aerodynamic, and there are competitions for that, but it would hold one person and not very comfortably.
Yeah, just to try to follow your calculation, you said that in Wisconsin you get about, you average year-round about 250 watts per square meter.
Yeah, in Wisconsin we average around 147 watts per meter squared.
147 watts, and your solar cells are 20% efficient.
Yep.
So you can get about 30 watts per square meter.
Correct.
And you need a kilowatt or 1.5 kilowatts to run a home.
Correct.
So that says you need about 50 square meters
So
of solar cell. How many panels is that? A panel is what they call a panel is like 1.2 square meters.
Meters, yeah, they're on the scale of meter squared. Yeah, depends on the manufacturer.
Okay, so you need something 45 panels or so to power
Yeah.
your house.
Yeah, you need a pretty large area. Yeah, so there's a limit to how much you could produce from your own roof, just based on area considerations. I mean, I really think if you really want to have as much of the energy created from sunlight as possible, then the solar farm route's really the way to go, because you know.
Right, and then you need the storage. What
Sure.
you say now is about the same cost.
Well, yeah. So it adds. I have a nice slide on storage here, but yeah, it adds cost, but the storage is coming down in price dramatically too. So what we're looking at here is, if you look at these two graphs, this is with batteries, this is without batteries. So you're adding maybe 50% more cost in each one of these scenarios, is really. So it adds 50%. So all these numbers I was saying. But they're still pretty competitive even still.
That's enough battery to get you overnight only, one day. You have to have sunshine every day for
Yeah,
that.
I believe this is around 7 kilowatt hours of energy. So it depends on your energy
So
usage.
7 hours of storage for an average house.
Sure, yeah.
Seems like you need a lot more than that.
You would. So this is for this particular calculation. So if you want double that, it'll probably double your cost. But this is coming down exponentially as well. So it's going to be just as viable as solar alone soon.
But then the lifetime of that's also not as long as the solar cell.
Perhaps. But it's all rapidly improving. So I'm pretty optimistic. Not debating you.
So I'm not sure this is your area to answer, but maybe somebody in the crowd, and it might put some insight in him. So I put panels on my house about a year ago, built a house, and it's been fantastic. So I've got 22 panels, and I've gone through an annual cycle now where my panels are producing more than we use in the house.
Okay.
Here's leading to my question. So during the summer, and we have MG&E, right? So during the summer, and you get your bill per month. So in the summer during that month, I'm producing more energy than I use. So in the day, my meter is turning the other way where I'm putting it into the grid, and they account for that, right? So in the summer, I'm producing electricity that MG&E buys, but they buy it at a much lower rate. They buy it at about 3 cents. So now in the winter, I'm leading up to my question, in the winter, I'm not producing in a month as much as I use.
Sure.
So on a monthly basis, I end up, in a given day I may produce more, but on a monthly basis, I'm actually buying from MG&E at the 15 cents. So my question is there, would it be futile, or is there a place, are you aware of efforts to at least make that accounting on an annual basis to where, the surplus that I'm producing, that I get, credit for that in the winter, you know what I'm saying, right? So are you aware of that? And then my follow-up is, from what you said, is it cheap enough that I could it seems like I could put storage in my basement, like in the summer where for those 5 months where I'm producing extra, I store it all up in the basement, and now in the winter where I'm coming up short, I could pull it back out. So
Sure.
kind of complicated, but yeah.
Sure. So the policy question, I'm not an expert on policy. I'm not aware of that policy, but it's constantly changing, and I don't know. It differs from state to state. I'm just not an expert in that. In terms of the storage, though, really the storage systems that I was just discussing, those are really made for day-night cycling. But the seasonal cycling, so 6-month type storage, that's a whole nother, whole nother worry.
I forgot to add at the beginning, you're a great instructor.
Thank you.
What is the cost of wind on average versus the solar? And including, it seems like there must be a lot more maintenance on wind than there is for the solar panels.
Sure. My impression is the cost is comparable for the two at the moment. Where that's headed in the future, maybe this economies of scale, solar will dip below that. But wind maybe is a better solution for winter, or right. I think in a realistic situation, you're never going to be able to only use solar to have all of our energy needs. But we could get a very large fraction from it, supplemented with things like solar, advances in energy storage, other clean technologies. So there should be a whole nother talk on wind, because there's been dramatic improvements in the economies of scale of that as well.
I got a couple things, but my first question would be, why is there a life cycle to the silicone, the PN,
Yeah.
and what causes it to wear out,
Sure.
if you will?
Sure. Yeah, so how long a silicon solar cell will last on your roof depends on how well it's manufactured. So it's like sealed, and things like water, oxygen will slowly oxidize the silicon. But the manufacturers are very good at sealing these. And so they are rated, and I believe in many cases guaranteed for a large number of years. So there is a slow decline in efficiency. You lose, so like every year, efficiency is 99.5% of what it was the previous year. You do that for 30 years, it's still very high efficiency. But when it ultimately fails, it could fail for a number of reasons, whether it be structural or maybe not chemical degradation of the silicon itself, but maybe corrosion of the wires and or whatever. There's so many different failure mechanisms. But the manufacturers have done a very good job at making sure these things last a long time. Yeah.
So if they were in an ideal situation, they
Yeah.
could pretty much last indefinitely if they weren't interfered with outside.
Eventually,
problems.
eventually, there's going to be oxidation
Yeah, okay.
and chemical degradation of the semiconductor itself. I just don't think that's usually the reason for the failure.
And then this is super visionary. See what you think. So if we could power the whole Earth with just sunlight, the way I think of that, maybe this is possible, is to put huge reflectors in orbit and reflecting sunlight down to like some station, and that generates the actual electricity, and then a grid that sends it all over, and have multiple spots around the Earth that would do that.
Sure.
How's that sound for visionary?
It's very visionary. I love it.
I hope they aim well. Over here?
Just to follow up on kind of the life of it, I think I could be off on this, but I think when I put in the panels a year ago, the warranty was 25 years or something like that. But so, we're putting in a lot of panels. So when their lifespan is over, are you aware of, or are you hopeful for, like a recycling of the panels or some use of them that we're not just totally scrapping them? Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. So these, I'm definitely aware of policy like that. So the company First Solar, which makes cadmium tellurium solar cells, they especially need a recycling policy because cadmium is toxic. It's not toxic when it's bonded to tellurium, but even still, you don't want to landfill those. So they have built into the price of the solar cell is reclamation. So in 25, 30 years, they will take it back, and they have a recycling process. So yes, there are policies like that in industry already.
Back here.
Hi, for the perovskites, what do you mean that's not stable? Is it like instead of going down 0.5% per year, it's multiple percent, or?
They might degrade over just a few years at best, right? So the different elements here start moving, it's called electromigration or chemically corroding, a bunch of degradation mechanisms. So it's way off. The lifetime is months to years, or if you don't encapsulate them well, then days. So one more big leap in research and development on this type of material is what's needed, not small improvements, but maybe one big conceptual leap which hasn't happened quite yet.
Okay. And then for the residential storage, what's the benefit to the consumer? Like, it seems like you're kind of just buying free storage for the utility company, because if everyone's, or almost everyone's already tied to the grid when they get solar, it's like as soon as
Sure.
the power goes
Well,
off, the battery's
like
going
the
off.
gentleman, I think, pointed out, is that the power company is only buying the power from you at a much reduced rate. So
Yeah.
economically, I think there is the gain by having your power, by having battery storage. And if you're off the grid, of course, then you need storage. So yeah, so there's economic and practical reasons for that.
Okay. Yeah, and then to answer his question, back when I lived in Iowa, at least because I've worked in solar for the last like 4-ish years. I know at least like Alliant Energy, the way they do their annual net metering is, I think you'd pick a month, like just normally like April or I think January, and they would see how much solar you produce for the year versus how much electricity you're consuming, and then they would square up with you once a year. But it depends on your utility company.
Right. It depends on utility company, depends on the state and the governments and the policy. And just to point out one thing is that this group Renew Wisconsin, which I think I spelled wrong here, they are, part of their activities are lobbying for better policies for solar. So if you're really passionate about this type of thing, or it might benefit you as a homeowner, then you might consider becoming involved with them.
Is there any significant effect from the, I don't know if albedo is the right name or not, but if your solar panels are on your roof, you have to air condition less in the summer.
Sure.
Do people take that into consideration, or is that not worth
In all
it?
the analyses I presented, I don't think that was taken into account, but that could result in additional savings as well. Yeah.
My sister's a firefighter. I'm wondering what happens, what do firefighters have to do if a house with panels catches fire?
I don't think that they're any more particularly flammable than, they're most of the mass there is not silicon, but just glass and metal. So it's just a lot of weight, actually. So I would think maybe the weight on the roof would be the extra consideration that would need to be taken into account.
And then I don't know how to pronounce it, the perovskites, did I get that?
Perovskites, yeah.
They have lead in them?
Yeah, the most efficient ones have lead in them now, although there's research on ones based on tin and other elements that would be more friendly. So the final ones may or may not have lead in them, but the most efficient ones now do have lead.
Okay. I'm assuming that's probably less than a house from 1920 burning anyway
Yeah,
with all the lead in it.
yeah, having lead is less than ideal.
Yeah. Any other questions? If not, thank you very much. This is fantastic. Appreciate it.
Thank you.